special report.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kira Phillips. President Trump about to address the nation from the White House, requesting for a moment of silence after the deadly midair collision here in our nation's capital.
Thank you very much. I speak to you this morning in an hour of anguish for our nation. Just before 9 p.m. last night, an American Airlines regional jet carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew collided with an Army Black Hawk helicopter carrying 3 military service members over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., while on final approach to Reagan National Airport. Both aircraft crashed instantly and were immediately submerged into the icy waters of the Potomac. Real tragedy. The massive search and rescue mission was underway throughout the night, leveraging every asset at our disposal. And I have to say, the local, state, federal, military, including the United States Coast Guard in particular, they've done a phenomenal job. So quick, so fast. It was mobilized immediately. The work has now shifted to a recovery mission. Sadly, there are no survivors. This was a dark and excruciating night in our nation's capital and in our nation's history, and a tragedy of terrible proportions. As one nation, we grieve for every precious soul that has been taken from us so suddenly. And we are a country of, really, we are in mourning. This has really shaken a lot of people, including people, very sadly, from other nations who were on the flight. For the family members back in Wichita, Kansas, here in Washington, D.C., and throughout the United States and in Russia, we have a Russia contingent, some very talented people. Unfortunately, were on that plane. Very, very, very sorry about that. Whose loved ones were aboard the passenger jet. We can only begin to imagine the agony that you're all feeling. Nothing worse. On behalf of the First Lady, myself, and 340 million Americans, our hearts are shattered alongside yours, and our prayers are with you now. And in the days to come, we'll be working very, very diligently in the days to come. We're here for you to wipe away the tears and to offer you our devotion, our love, and our support. There's great support. In moments like this, the differences between Americans fade to nothing compared to the bonds of affection and loyalty that unite us all, both as Americans and even as nations. We are one family, and today we are all heartbroken. We're all searching for answers. That icy, icy Potomac, it was a cold, cold night, cold water. We're all overcome with the grief for many who have so tragically perished, will no longer be with us. Together we take solace in the knowledge that their journey ended not in the cold waters of the Potomac, but in the warm embrace of a loving God. We do not know what led to this crash, but we have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now. Because over the years I've watched as things like this happen, and they say, well, we're always investigating, and then the investigation 3 years later, they announce it. We think we have some pretty good ideas, but we'll find out how this disaster occurred, and we'll ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. The FAA and the NTSB and the U.S. military will be carrying out a systematic and comprehensive investigation. Our new Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, his second day on the job when that happened. It's a rough one. We'll be working tirelessly. He's a great gentleman. The whole group these are great people, and they are working tirelessly to figure out exactly what happened. We will state certain opinions, however. I'm also immediately appointing an acting commissioner to the FAA, Christopher Rocheleau, a 22-year veteran of the agency, highly respected. Christopher, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We must have only the highest standards for those who work in our aviation system. I changed the Obama standards from very mediocre at best to extraordinary You remember that. Only the highest aptitude, have to be the highest intellect and psychologically superior people were allowed to qualify for air traffic controllers. That was not so prior to getting there. When I arrived in 2016, I made that change very early on because I always felt this was a job that, and other jobs too, but this was a job that had to be superior intelligence. And we didn't really have that, and we had it. And then when I left office and Biden took over, he changed them back to lower than ever before. I put safety first. Obama, Biden, and the Democrats put policy first. And they put politics at a level that nobody's ever seen, because this was the lowest level. Their policy was horrible, and their politics was even worse. So as you know, last week, long before the crash, I signed an executive order restoring our highest standards for air traffic controllers and other important jobs throughout the country. So it was very interesting. About a week ago, almost upon entering office, I signed something last week that was an executive order, very powerful, on restoring the highest standards of air traffic controllers and others, by the way. Then my administration will set the highest possible bar for aviation safety. We have to have our smartest people. It doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak, who they are. It matters intellect, talent, the word talent. They have to be talented, naturally talented geniuses. You can't have regular people doing that job. They won't be able to do it. But we'll restore faith in American air travel. I'll have more to say about that. I do want to point out that various articles that appeared prior to my entering office, and here's one. The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. And then it says FAA says people with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in, and they want them, they can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so. This was in January 14th, so that was a week before I entered office. They put a big push to put diversity into the FAA's program. Then another article, the Federal Aviation Administration, this was before I got to office, recently, second term. The FAA is actively recruiting workers who suffer severe intellectual disabilities, psychiatric problems, and other mental and physical conditions under a diversity and inclusion hiring initiative spelled out on the agency's website. Can you imagine? These are people that are, I mean, actually, their lives are shortened because of the stress that they have. Brilliant people have to be in those positions, and their lives are actually shortened, very substantially shortened, because of the stress, where you have many, many planes coming into one target, and you need a very special talent and a very special genius to be able to do it. Targeted disabilities are those disabilities that the federal government, as a matter of policy, has identified for special emphasis in recruitment and hiring. The FAA's website states they include hearing, vision, missing extremities, partial paralysis, complete paralysis, epilepsy, severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism all qualify for the position of a controller of airplanes pouring into our country, pouring into a little spot, a little dot on the map, a little runway. The initiative is part of the FAA's diversity and inclusion hiring plan. Think of that. The initiative is part of the FAA's diversity and inclusion hiring plan, which says diversity is integral to achieving FAA's mission of ensuring safe and efficient travel. I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's just the opposite. The FAA website shows that the agency's guidance on diversity hiring were last updated on March 23rd of 22. They wanted to make it even more so. And then I came in, and I assume maybe this is the reason. The FAA which is overseen by Secretary Pete Buttigieg. A real winner. That guy's a real winner. Do you know how badly everything's run since he's run this Department of Transportation? He's a disaster. He was a disaster as a mayor. He ran his city into the ground, and he's a disaster now. He's just got a good line of bullshit. The Department of Transportation, his government agency charged with regulating civil aviation. Well, he runs it, 45,000 people, and he's run it right into the ground with his diversity. So I had to say that it's terrible. Then it's a group within the FAA, another story, determined that the workforce was too white, that they had concerted efforts to get the administration to change that and to change it immediately. This was in the Obama administration just prior to my getting there. And we took care of African Americans, Hispanic Americans. We took care of everybody at levels that nobody's ever seen before. It's one of the reasons I won. But they actually came out with a directive, too white. And we want the people that are competent. But now we mourn and we pray and would like to ask all Americans to join me in a moment of silence as we ask God to watch over those who have lost their lives and bring comfort to the loved ones. And I just want to say God bless everyone in this room. This has been a terrible, very short period of time. We'll get to the bottom of it. So we all saw the same thing. We've seen it many times. I've had the honor of hearing tapes. Tapes are scary, very scary tapes. You had a airliner coming in, American Airlines. He was doing everything right. He was on track. He was the same track as everybody else. They came in. It's probably the same track as they've had for 25 years or more. He's coming in the path. And for some reason, he had a helicopter that was at the same height, obviously when they hit, but pretty much the same height, and going at an angle that was unbelievably bad. When the air traffic controller said, do you see, he was talking about, do you see him? But there was very little time left when that was stated. And then also, he said, follow him in. And then almost immediately after that, seconds after that, there was the crash that took place. Well, you follow him in, that means like everything's fine, follow him in. You had a pilot problem from the standpoint of the helicopter. I mean, because it was visual. It was a very clear night. It was cold, but clear, and clear as you could be. The American Airlines plane had lights blazing. They had all of their landing lights on. I could see it from the Kennedy Center tape. We had a tape up on the Kennedy Center. That seems to be the primary thus far. I'm sure we'll see other tapes because it's such an area where there are a lot of cameras looking up into the air, into space. So we'll probably see many other shots of it before too much time goes by. But we had a situation where you had a helicopter that had the ability to stop. I have helicopters. You can stop a helicopter very quickly. It had the ability to go up or down. It had the ability to turn. And the turn it made was not the correct turn, obviously. It did somewhat the opposite of what it was told. We don't know that that would have been the difference because the timing was so tight. It was so little. There was so little time to think. But what you did have is you had vision. The helicopter had vision of the plane because you had vision of it all the way, perfect vision of it all the way from at Kennedy Center where the tape was taken. And for some reason, there weren't adjustments made. Again, you could have slowed down the helicopter substantially. You could have stopped the helicopter. You could have gone up. You could have gone down. You could have gone straight up, straight down. You could have turned. You could have done a million different maneuvers. For some reason, it just kept going and then made a slight turn at the very end. And by that time, it was too late. They shouldn't have been at the same height. Because if it wasn't the same height, you could have gone under it or over it, and nobody realized, or they didn't say that it's at the same height. At the same height, it still wouldn't have been great, but you would have missed it by quite a bit. Could have been 1,000 feet higher. It could have been 200 feet lower. But it was exactly at the same height, and somebody should have been able to point that out. So all of this is going to be studied, but it just seems to me, from a couple of words that I like to use, the words common sense, some really bad things happened, and some things happened that shouldn't have happened. So you had a helicopter going in an identical direction. You had a helicopter that was at the exact same height as somebody going in essentially the opposite direction. You had a plane that was following a track, which is a track that every other plane followed. And I don't imagine, I know I've heard today that they might have been following the preceding plane, which was pretty close, but not that close, the preceding plane. But you wouldn't have even been able to see that because of the direction that the helicopter was coming in at. So you had a confluence of bad decisions that were made. And you have people that lost their lives, violently lost their lives. We're going to take a few questions. I'd like to ask our new Secretary of Transportation to say a few words. Sean Duffy, great gentleman, just started. It's not your fault, and I know you agree with me very strongly on intellect and even psychological well-being of the air traffic control. It's such an important position, and I think I can't emphasize stronger. I changed it when I first ran in 2016. I changed it. We had the highest standard that you could have, and then they changed it back. That was Biden, to a standard I read it to you. That was from one of your papers. One of the people in this room actually wrote that. And then I changed it back a few days ago. And unfortunately, that was, we'll see. We don't know that necessarily it's even the controller's fault. But one thing we do know, there was a lot of vision, and people should have been able to see that, you know, at what point do you stop? At what point do you say, wow, that plane's getting a little bit close? So this is a tragedy that should not have happened. Please, Sean.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would just note the President's leadership has been remarkable during this crisis. We've had a whole of government response, local, state, federal. And when you see that kind of cooperation, it begins with the leadership in this body. So thank you for that, Mr. President. You make our jobs a lot easier. You made an important point that when we deal with safety, we can only accept the best and the brightest in positions of safety that impact the lives of our loved ones, our family members. And I think you make a really important point on that, Mr. President. That is the motto of your presidency: the best and the brightest, the most intelligent coming into these spaces. I want to take a moment and extend my condolences to the families of the loved ones. We commit to them that we are going to get to the bottom of this investigation, not in 3 years, not in 4 years, but as quickly as possible, with the NTSB, who is here today, as well as the FAA. What happened yesterday shouldn't have happened. It should not have happened. And when Americans take off in airplanes, they should expect to land at their destination. That didn't happen yesterday. That's not acceptable. And so we will not accept excuses. We will not accept passing the buck. We are going to take responsibility at the Department of Transportation and the FAA to make sure we have the reforms that have been dictated by President Trump in place to make sure that these mistakes do not happen again. And again, I want to thank you for your leadership, Mr. President, and I appreciate the confidence you placed in me. Thank you.
Pete, would you like to say something?
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Again, I want to echo what the Transportation Secretary said about your leadership. From the moment we found out about this, we were in contact with the White House trying to determine exactly what happened. I would echo it as well. No excuses. We're going to get to the bottom of this. We first and foremost, from the Defense Department, want to pass our condolences to the 64 souls and their families that were affected by this. Never should happen. And certainly the 3 service members, the 3 soldiers, a young captain, Staff Sergeant and CW2, Chief Warrant Officer, on a routine annual retraining of night flights on a standard corridor for a continuity of government mission. The military does dangerous things. It does routine things on the regular basis. Tragically, last night, a mistake was made. I think the president is right. There was some sort of an elevation issue that we have immediately begun investigating at the DOD and Army level. Army CID is on the ground investigating. Top-tier aviation assets inside the DOD are investigating, sir, to get to the bottom of it so that it does not happen again, because it's absolutely unacceptable. But I want to echo what the Transportation Secretary and you, Mr. President, said, because it pertains to the DOD as well. We will have the best and brightest in every position possible. As you said in your inaugural, it is colorblind and merit-based. The best leaders possible, whether it's flying Black Hawks and flying airplanes, leading platoons, or in government. The era of DEI is gone at the Defense Department, and we need the best and brightest, whether it's in our air traffic control, or whether it's in our generals, or whether it's throughout government. So thank you for your leadership and courage on that, sir, and we'll stand by you on it. Thank you
very much. JD, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, for your leadership. I just want to reemphasize something the President said, and you've heard from the Secretary of Transportation and of Defense. There really was a whole of government response. We were all on the phone. We were all communicating yesterday, trying to get to the bottom of this immediately, but also try to communicate with the American people about what happened. Something the President said that I think bears reemphasizing, which is that when you don't have the best standards in who you're hiring, it means, on the one hand, you're not getting the best people in government, but on the other hand, it puts stresses on the people who are already there. And I think that is a core part of what President Trump is going to bring and has already brought to Washington, D.C., is we want to hire the best people because we want the best people at air traffic control, and we want to make sure we have enough people at air traffic control who are actually competent to do the job. If you go back to just some of the headlines over the past 10 years, you have many hundreds of people suing the government because they would like to be air traffic controllers, but they were turned away because of the color of their skin. That policy ends under Donald Trump's leadership because safety is the first priority of our aviation industry. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, on DEI and the claims that you've made, are you saying this crash was somehow caused and the result of diversity hiring? And what evidence have you seen to support these claims?
It just could have been. We have a high standard. We've had a much higher standard than anybody else. And there are things where you have to go by brain power. You have to go by psychological quality. And psychological quality is a very important element of it. These are various very powerful tests that we put to use, and they were terminated by Biden. And Biden went by a standard that's the exact opposite. So we don't know, but we do know that you had two planes at the same level. You had a helicopter and a plane. That shouldn't have happened. And we'll see. We're going to look into that, and we're going to see. But certainly for an air traffic controller, we want the brightest, the smartest, the sharpest. We want somebody that's psychologically superior, and that's what we're going to have. Yeah.
Mr. President.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Mr. President, you mentioned at the top of the briefing that there were several Russian nationals on the flight.
Yes.
Will the U.S. government be willing to facilitate the transfer of their remains, considering the fact there is no direct air travel between the two countries?
We've already been in contact with Russia, and the answer is yes, we will facilitate. Yes.
Mr. President.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. The situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is getting worse, even though President John Lorenzo has been mediating the conflict between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo because he wants to bring peace and stability. The situation is really bad right now. I want to hear from Mr. President if you have any plan in the future to bring peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
You're asking me a question about Rwanda, and it is a very serious problem, I agree, but I don't think it's appropriate right now to talk about it, but it is a very serious problem.
Mr. President, we don't even yet know the names of the 67 people who were killed, and you are blaming Democrats and DEI policies and air traffic control and seemingly the member of the U.S. military who was flying that Black Hawk helicopter. Don't you think you're getting ahead of the investigation right now?
No, I don't think so at all. I don't think with the names of the people, you mean the names of the people that are on the plane? You think that's going to make a difference?
Does it comfort their families?
They are a group of people that have lost their lives, If you want a list of the names, we can give you that. We'll be giving that very soon. We're in coordination with American Airlines. We're in coordination very strongly, obviously, with the military. But I think that's not a very smart question.
But are you
I'm
blaming,
surprised coming from you.
Are you blaming
please.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, President Trump. Thank you for being here. Based on your analysis so far, do you have a sense of who was at fault, if it was the plane, the helicopter, air traffic control, and can you assure people that it is safe to fly in and out of D.C.?
Well, I've given you the analysis, and the analysis was it was based on vision. You had a lot of people that saw what was happening. You had some people that knew what was happening. There was some warnings, but the warnings were given very, very late. You know, those warnings were given very late. It was almost as they were given. A few seconds later, there was the crash. It should have been brought up earlier. But the people in the helicopter should have seen where they were going. I can't imagine people with 20/20 vision not seeing, you know, what's happening up there. Again, they shouldn't have been at the same height. You're going in reverse directions or sideways directions. Obviously, you want to be at different heights. I see it all the time when I'm flying. You have planes going in the opposite. They're always lower. We're higher. So if somehow there's a screw up, there's not going to be a tragedy. It'll be close. But, you know, there's never going to be a tragedy if you're at a different elevation. For whatever reason, they were at the same elevation. And also, from the American Airlines standard, he's along the track that every plane is along. You say, what was a helicopter doing in that track? It's very sad. But visually, somebody should have been able to see and taken that helicopter out of play, and they should have been at a different height.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned the Russians that were on board that plane. What other nationalities were on board that passenger jet?
There were a couple of others. We're going to be announcing it in about an hour. We have some very specific information. We're calling the countries. We've spoken to most of them, but there were some other countries represented.
Mr. President, have you spoken to President Putin?
I have not, no.
Mr. President, on your executive order,
not about this.
On your executive order, you've already issued an executive order you say will restore aviation safety.
Right.
This crash happened after that. Was the executive order successful, and what more needs to change to keep people safe?
Well, you know, we issued it 3 days ago, and we're in the process of making those changes. This is something that should have been done a long time ago. Actually, my original order should have never been changed, and I think maybe you wouldn't have had this problem. Maybe. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. We see, like, everyday life that very often those diversity hires cause sometimes issues, as you just mentioned. So what plan do you have? Are we going to see some fire? Are you going to fire some of those diversity hires in the federal government? What plan do you have?
I would say the answer is yes. If we find that people aren't mentally competent, you see the language. The language is put out by them. And if you see that, I'm not going to bore you by reading it again, but these are not people that should be doing this particular job. They'd be very good for certain jobs, but not people that should be doing this particular job.
Mr. President, you have today blamed the diversity elements, but then told us that you weren't sure that the controllers made any mistake. You then said perhaps the helicopter pilots were the ones who made the mistake.
It's all under investigation.
I understand that. That's why I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't. We want brilliant people doing this. This is a major chess game at the highest level. When you have 60 planes coming in during a short period of time, and they're all coming in different directions, and you're dealing with very high-level computer work and very complex computers. And one of the other things I will tell you is that the systems that were built, I was going to rebuild the entire system, and then we had an election that didn't turn out the way it should have. But they didn't build the systems properly. They spent a lot of money renovating a system, spending much more money than they would have spent if they bought a new system for air traffic controllers, meaning the computerized systems. There are certain companies that do a very good job. They didn't use those companies. They used companies that should not have been doing it. No, I think it's very important to understand that for some jobs, and not only this, but air traffic controllers, they have to be at the highest level of genius. Okay.
I want to ask you about the ice skaters in a moment because the U.S. Ice Skating Committee was affected. But first, if I can, the cited FAA text that you read is real. But the implication that this policy is new or that it stems from efforts that began under President Biden or the Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is demonstrably false. It's been on the FAA's
Who said
website.
That, you?
No, it's on the website, the FAA's website. It was there in 2013. It was there for the entirety.
What I read.
It was there for the entirety of your administration too. So my question is, why didn't you change the policy during your first administration?
I did change it. I changed the Obama policy, and we had a very good policy. And then Biden came in, and he changed it. And then when I came in 2 days, 3 days ago, I signed a new order, bringing it to the highest level of intelligence. Okay.
It was on the website.
Please. Quiet.
Welcome back to the. I'm sorry. You mentioned that a vision was probably the problem that was at issue in this crash. There's been some reports that one of the pilots in the helicopter may have been using night vision equipment. Was there any indication?
I heard that. We don't know. We're going to know that pretty soon. It may change your view plane if you do have the night vision. So it's very possible that could have happened. That would be maybe a reason why you wouldn't actually see as well as on a clear night. You can see sometimes better without it. I have a couple of more.
Mr. President, is it helpful to have your Secretary of Transportation confirmed, and does this intensify your interest in getting other nominees confirmed quickly?
Go to what?
Is it helpful to have your Secretary of Transportation confirmed, and does this intensify your interest in getting other nominees confirmed quickly as well?
Well, sure. We want fast confirmations. And the Democrats, as you know, are doing everything they can to delay them. They've taken too long. We're struggling to get very good people that everybody knows are going to be confirmed, but we're struggling to get them out faster. We want them out faster. It's a good question, actually. We've been pushing Sean. Everyone knows Sean for a long time. He got many, many Democrat votes, but they want to take as long as they can. They ask questions like some of the questions that Peter would ask that were totally irrelevant and not very good questions, but they want to just keep it going. They want to keep it going as long as possible. I was very honored, actually, that you got so many Democrat votes. That was really good. That was really good.
When I try to meet with the families, and second question, is it your impression that military training was done during that time?
The what?
The training that the helicopter was involved in. Is it anything you can tell us about
You
that?
don't know. These are the things that will come up with the investigation. You don't know, but the helicopter obviously was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a tragedy occurred. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I've got a question about the...
No, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. You've been critical of the current regulations, and you've called for big reforms at FAA. I'm curious, sir,
I made the reforms, actually.
What is your message?
3 days ago, I made them.
Yes, sir. What is your message then to the American public in the weeks and months ahead? Should they feel hesitant to fly? And if you could clarify perhaps something that the Defense Secretary said when he said that this helicopter was on a continuity of government mission?
I don't know what that refers to, but they were practicing. They do that. They call it practicing, and they were, and that's something that should be done. It's only continuity in the sense that we want to have very good people, and that has to be in continuity, and that's what they refer to. But it was basically practice, and it was a practice that worked out very, very badly. Okay?
On his question, the first question, should people be hesitant to fly right now?
No, not at all. I've not hesitated to fly. This is something that it's been many years that something like this has happened. And the collision is just something that we don't expect ever to happen again. We are going to have the highest level people. We've already hired some of the people that you've already hired for that position long before we knew about this. I mean, long before. From the time I came in, we started going out and getting the best people because I said it's not appropriate what they're doing. I think it's a tremendous mistake. You know, they like to do things and they like to take them too far, and this is sometimes what ends up happening. Now, with that, I'm not blaming the controller. I'm saying there are things that you could question, like the height of the helicopter, the height of the plane being at the same level and going in opposite directions. It's not a positive. But no, we're already hiring people. No, flying is very safe. We have the safest flying anywhere in the world, and we'll keep it that way. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, yeah, hold on. An hour of anguish for our nation. No survivors. 64 passengers and crew on board that American Airlines flight. 3 U.S. soldiers flying that Black Hawk helicopter. Now, we all want to know what happened in the dead of night here in Washington, D.C. Let's start with our transportation correspondent, Gio Benitez. He is there on the scene of the crash, where recovery efforts are in full force right now to find those remaining victims. Gio, what do we know?
So, Kira, let's take this step by step with what we know exactly. It started with this American Airlines plane originally scheduled to land on runway 1. That is the biggest runway here. It is also the busiest runway in the country. It is just nonstop. At the last moment, air traffic control changed that to runway 33. Now, we don't know exactly why, but we do know that that was pretty commonplace. This happens all the time here at this airport. The American Airlines CEO says that everything was looking normal on approach as they were landing. Then it gets to the helicopter, and this is the Black Hawk. And that Black Hawk was at 350 feet. And for some reason, it seemed to be heading toward the plane. And again, we don't know why that happened either, but we do know that air traffic control actually said to the Black Hawk pilot, "Do you see the plane?" And they confirmed that they saw the plane, or at least a plane. And we just don't know if there was any confusion there in the Black Hawk at the time. We know that there were three different soldiers there in the Black Hawk conducting this training mission. That doesn't mean they were inexperienced. It just means that this is sort of like a routine training that the military is always doing. And at that point, that's what we don't know. What happened? Did they get confused? And so there are many questions about that particular moment with the Black Hawk, Kira.
Gio, stay with us. Also with us, pilot and aviation consultant Steve Ganyard. Steve, I understand from the tower audio that the Army pilot did confirm twice that he had eyes on the American Airlines plane. Could flying on night vision goggles in an urban environment with lots of light sources, ambient light, have caused him to misidentify the airline traffic?
Kira, the short answer is yes, but it would have happened perhaps whether they were on night vision goggles or not. Being at that altitude and being asked to pick out something that is either moving or flashing or looks very much like the background. As they were coming in, they would have been looking at the lights of, say, Alexandria on the other side of the river. And so obviously they thought they had the airplane. They thought they had their interval, the regional jet in sight, but they clearly did not. I think one of the things that we need to come back to here is, as Gio pointed out, this crew said, we see the airplane and we assume responsibility for visual separation, meaning that the crew of that helicopter, believing that they had the airplane in sight, said, we will make sure that we stay behind him and we will not get in his way. So that boils down to who's at fault here. And if that is the case, then we need to figure out why. Gio brought up some things that the president also brought up. Were they at the right height? They were supposed to be staying at 200 feet or below as they transit on the route along the river. So that will be a question. The president brought up that perhaps the direction from the controller was late. That may be something else that they'll want to look at, but the fact that the Black Hawk pilots assumed responsibility puts it back, the onus back on them to make sure that no midair occurred. So now we have to figure out what happened, but it's quite easy for any pilot who has ever flown at night to understand how the crew in that Black Hawk helicopter may have thought that what they saw was the airplane that they were supposed to follow, when in fact it was either another airplane somewhere else or a light on the ground. So this is not something, it's probably human error, but it's also something that has happened many times in the past in aviation, and it's something that the FAA is going to have to go back and look at in terms of separating helicopter traffic and fixed-wing traffic coming into DCA.
Meanwhile, there is no current FAA administrator. The president, they're announcing in the briefing he's now appointed an ad acting administrator for the FAA, Christopher Rocheleau. We will talk more about him in just a second, but I want to bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz. Martha, we now know that this Army helicopter was executing a training mission, but these pilots were not rookies.
They were not rookies. In fact, what Pete Hegseth said earlier today was they were fairly experienced. This is a requirement right now, these annual night evaluations going down the river. These are helicopters that ferry VIPs or senior Army leadership regularly. So this crew was practicing that sort of movement, even though they'd probably done it many, many times before. As Steve said, they train in the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps all the time. That is what readiness is all about, and that's what they were doing on this mission, on this training mission. But today, President Trump's Army Secretary nominee, Daniel Driscoll, said there are appropriate times to take risk and there are inappropriate times to take risk. I think we might need to look at where is an appropriate time to take training risk, and it may not be near at an airport like Reagan, where the airplane was hit. But Hegseth said very, very clearly today a mistake was made, and they were clearly pointing the finger at the helicopter, although the president kept referencing air traffic control as well. He also said something that stood out to me, which I have not heard, which they were going in opposite directions, because we have been told that they were both in that landing pattern. So I don't know where that particular comment came from, but it's something that they will look at. They will look at everything. Clearly, the administration wants to get information out as soon as possible, Kara.
Martha, thank you. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. She was inside that briefing. She's in the briefing room now. Mary, just 10 days into his presidency, Trump is taking on his first national tragedy and wasting no time bringing up diversity hires into the conversation here as a possible cause of this crash with no evidence at all. And you challenged the president on that.
I did, and Kira, I think it's important to be clear here that what we just heard from the president was a lot of speculation, but not a lot of answers or clarity into what actually caused this crash. He has suggested it may have been the air traffic controllers. He pointed to possibly the pilots of the helicopter, and repeatedly, yes, he suggested that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs may somehow have played a role here. Of course, in the week and a half that he has been in office, he has made clear that he is targeting these programs, trying to strip them away from the federal government. And I did ask him point blank, is he suggesting that diversity hiring is somehow to blame for this crash, and what evidence had he seen to suggest that? And he told me it just could have been. He admitted, quote, "We don't know," pressed again by another one of my colleagues here in the room as to how he could have been suggesting this was a diversity hiring issue, given that this is still an ongoing investigation and there's still so much that remains unknown. And the president said, it's because I have common sense. I think it's also important to note here that just a few hours ago, earlier this morning, his own new Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, said point blank everything was standard in the lead up to this crash. The bottom line, Kira, right now, we simply still do not know what caused this crash.
Mary Bruce, thank you. We will be back on the air for the NTSB briefing later this afternoon. Our coverage continues now on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. David Muir will have the latest on World News Tonight from D.C. I'm Kira Phillips. We take you now back to your regular programming, and I'll see you back on ABC News Live.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, we have continuing coverage now of that deadly midair crash. After an update there from President Trump, that collision happened over Washington, D.C. The president called it a dark and excruciating night in our nation's capital and in our nation's history. 67 people are dead, including 3 service members, after a military helicopter crashed into an American Airlines flight. Trump expressed his condolences and promised the investigation will uncover what happened. But in the meantime, he said it's possible the collision could have been the result of the FAA hiring unqualified workers in an effort to push diversity. He later clarified he has no evidence of that. He also seemed to blame the helicopter pilot, saying the helicopter took a bad angle, should have been able to stop or avoid the plane, and, quote, did somewhat the opposite of what it was told. Roughly 30 bodies have been pulled from the wreckage in the Potomac River so far, and a massive recovery effort is underway for the remaining victims. ABC News senior White House correspondent Selena Wang is following that from the White House. ABC News transportation reporter Sam Sweeney has been following this investigation for us, and ABC News senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katursky is here with me now. So, Aaron, how is the president's description of the helicopter taking a wrong turn compared to what other officials are saying in terms of what we know so far of how this happened?
So far, we had heard that authorities believed that both the helicopter and the plane were on a similar glide path into Reagan National Airport. The president seemed to suggest something different, that perhaps there was an errant turn by the helicopter pilots. He did not say where that information occurred or the origin of it, but it does seem at odds with what the narrative has been so far. Something happened where air traffic control, according to the audio that we've heard, was in contact with the helicopter, affirming that the pilots aboard the helicopter saw the aircraft. They affirmed that they had seen the aircraft. It's possible, using night vision goggles, that the pilots may have become disoriented. That's going to be a key early focus of the investigation. And
I want to bring in our international affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, because, Martha, you have been along on these training missions sometimes when they are using these night vision goggles. What is that like, and how easy is it to confuse another aircraft or city lights for that plane? Because in this case, the pilot did say that he saw the plane, and now, of course, the speculation is maybe he didn't.
I have not only been on training exercises, but I've been in combat zones in those helicopters, flying at night, very dark, trying to keep a low profile with the crew on those night vision goggles. It is definitely harder to fly any aircraft with those night vision goggles because sometimes the lights and the lights of the city and like we are seeing there, the lights behind could have confused the pilot somehow. Look at those, as Aaron alluded to there, as you come in. They did say they could see the regional jet, but were they actually looking at the right jet? Because sometimes there are those flares, or you focus. It was very dark. The river was absolutely black. I was there last night, and sometimes that can confuse, or you think you have your eyes locked on something, and you actually have your eyes locked on the wrong things. That will definitely be something they look at. It is true that the president saying that they were going in opposite directions. We have not heard that. We have been told that they were both in a landing formation. But the altitude is something they will definitely look at. Those aircraft, the helicopters are supposed to stay below 200 feet. Radar showed it at 350 feet. There was also, the president brought up that they didn't know for sure whether they were on night vision goggles, even though Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, said quite definitively earlier today that they were using night vision goggles. And frankly, that would be very, very standard. I would be surprised if they weren't using those kind of goggles, particularly for a training mission when they're trying to see exactly what they'd have to do when they do their regular jobs. But also, again, these training missions are required. You do those for readiness, whether you're a pilot, whether you're an infantryman, whether you're an armor, whatever you do in the military, you train to stay proficient in what you are doing. But clearly the emphasis is on that helicopter. I was thinking today, it's in a way like when you were driving, if a driver stops in front of you and you rear-end that driver, it is your fault. No matter what the driver in front of you did, it is your fault if you run into that driver.
And I want to bring in ABC News contributor and former Marine Corps fighter pilot Colonel Steve Ganyard for more on that, because, Steve, what we're hearing from the president, this description of he's not outright saying blame, but it does sound like he's blaming the helicopter pilot here, saying he could have turned, he could have stopped, right? This should have been avoided. How difficult are these kinds of training missions? Because there were questions earlier as to the level of experience of the people on this helicopter, given it was a training mission. But we heard from the defense secretary earlier that they were experienced. And so talk to me about these training missions and just the difficulty involved in them sometimes.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter if you have thousands of hours in an aircraft, whether it's a helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft. Proficiency is important. If you only fly 1 or 2 hours a month, you are not proficient, and you're close to being dangerous. If you're flying 30 hours a month, or some airline pilots flying 70, they're very proficient. They're very good at the airplane. It's almost as if the airplane is wrapped around you, and you can almost mind meld with the airplane. But when you have low proficiency, then everything's hard. And as Martha noted, everything flying at night is hard, and everything happens much more slowly. And so proficiency is important. Yes, they were experienced aviators. If there had been a training mission with a very new pilot in there, then maybe this would be a little bit more understandable. But again, training is important, and as we used to say, you're going to fight as you train. And if you don't train hard, which sometimes and oftentimes in military aviation involves danger and risk, and you mitigate that risk, but you still have to be able to train in the kinds of circumstances that you're going to go fight in. And so maybe that shouldn't be done around the National Capital Region. Maybe it shouldn't be done that close to DCA. These are real things that not only the military, but the FAA is going to want to look at again.
And Steve, in terms of the experience you need to have, the expertise you need to have, what kind of qualifications do you need to have to end up in a helicopter pilot like that at this level, or in an air traffic control tower at this level?
Yeah, there are very specific procedures. Anybody that's come to Washington, D.C., you know that there are helicopters flying up and down the river all the time, sometimes over the bridges quite low. I mean, it's fun to watch them, but they need to stay low because you know the departure approach end of the north part of DCA is right there. And so being able to fly around Washington with towers and the restricted area, prohibited area around the White House, it's very important that you know where you are within DCA and that you're abiding by the procedures and the rules. Sometimes you have helicopters flying up the river and down the river, and so which side do you take? So there's actually specific training where people have to go through, this is how you fly around Washington, D.C. And so undoubtedly, if we looked at the ground track of where this helicopter crew was last night, we can understand what they were doing and how they were practicing flying along the river. The president brought up and Geo brought up, and we're still going to have to look at what altitude were they at. Normally below 200 feet, and you're good. There have been some suggestions that I have not seen the data that 350 feet is where they were. But it all comes down to the helicopter pilots were supposed to see and avoid that regional jet. And they believed they had it in sight, but apparently, tragically, they did not.
And Sam, the president also made some big claims about DEI, saying that he didn't have any evidence that that was at play here, but that it's possible that it was. He talked about the FAA recruiting people with severe intellectual and psychological capabilities. What can you tell us about that?
The FAA hires the most qualified people out there. The selection process is so long, so incredibly difficult to become an air traffic controller that we are in a shortage because of that. You can't be older than 31. You have to pass medical tests, knowledge tests. You have to go through an extensive course. And then there's 4 years of training just to get into a small regional airport. This is one of the biggest, most complicated airspaces in the country and airports. These are the most advanced and qualified people. There is no evidence suggesting that any one specific person in that tower is responsible for this crash.
Aaron, where does the investigation stand now?
The focus remains on the water. When the two aircraft collided, they came down instantly into relatively shallow water between 5 and 8 feet in the Potomac. The plane broke essentially into two main pieces. There are other pieces of debris, certainly, but the fuselage still contains bodies that will have to be extracted in the water. Dive teams will remain there to do that for as long as it takes until they can get everybody out. So far, we're told they've pulled roughly 3 dozen or so bodies out. There are not going to be any survivors. The debris field, however, does extend for a wide swath of the Potomac as the current has carried smaller items like, sadly, human remains, baggage, whatever was on the plane. That has been washing up along the riverbank, and there are multiple collection points established to collect all of that material.
And I want to bring in our senior White House correspondent, Selena Wang, because, Selena, the president was also very critical of the Biden administration, of the Obama administration, especially critical of the former Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg. What did you make of those remarks and the changes he's talking about there?
Yeah, Diane, if we first just take a step back here, this is the first national tragedy that Trump is addressing the nation with in his second term. And he started out with this message of unity, saying this is a time of tragedy and mourning in America. But then, as you say, he very quickly shifted to these political attacks. He offered a lot of speculation without any evidence, seeming to place blame on the Obama and Biden administration for hiring air traffic controllers who are unqualified. And then he went on to attack the diversity hiring under the Biden-Obama administrations. This is, of course, something that Trump has been gutting from the federal government, these DEI initiatives, without offering any evidence. And this is also despite the fact, Diane, and this is important, that the DEI policy that he was referring to in the FAA was actually in place during the entirety of his first administration. Trump also went on to talk about possible problems with the helicopter placing plane there, about the height that it was flying at, as you've been discussing with Sam and others, and also placing blame potentially, as I just mentioned, on those air traffic controllers. But at times there, Diane, he was seeming to contradict what his own transportation secretary had said earlier today, that this plane and this helicopter, they were on a standard flight path and that there was nothing unusual here. But also importantly, President Trump was asked whether or not he can definitively say that Americans should feel safe flying. And he said that yes, people should not be hesitant to fly. He said this collision is something we don't expect to happen ever again. He also wanted to make clear that this investigation is not going to take years, that they want to move very swiftly here. Another issue that the president wasn't pressed on as much was this question of why this Army training was happening late at night in this crowded airspace at the very busy DCA Reagan National Airport. And I want to tell you something that his Army secretary, who is currently undergoing confirmation, said today. He said, quote, I think we might need to look at where's an appropriate time to take training risk, and it may not be at an airport like Reagan.
And I want to bring in our transportation correspondent, Gio Benitez, who's there in D.C. as well, because Gio, one of the things the president also said was that the plane and the helicopter were at the same height, and he's saying someone should have pointed that out. Is there any indication that there was a communication breakdown here?
Well, at this point, we just don't know, because what we do know is that the helicopter is, in fact, supposed to be under 200 feet. So that we know, and it was, for some reason, at 350 feet. Now, what we do know is that there was a change in runways, Diane. So originally, this American Airlines plane was supposed to land on runway 1. That is the biggest runway here at DCA. It's also the busiest runway in the country. They switched that to runway 33, which is a smaller runway. There's nothing really unusual about that. But that instruction would have happened on air traffic control audio. So the Black Hawk would have heard that instruction. Then you hear the air traffic controller asking the Black Hawk if they have eyes on the plane and if they can see it. The Black Hawk pilot confirmed that they, in fact, could see the plane. Now, were they looking at another plane? We don't know that. But we do know, just based on what you're seeing, is that it appears as if the Black Hawk is heading straight toward the plane for some unknown reason. So there are so many questions about that, especially with the same height. So we don't know what kind of confusion happened. Were they maybe disoriented in some way? We know that there's been talk of the night goggles. We don't know what that could have played here. But there's so many questions specifically about that moment with the Black Hawk and those final seconds there, quite frankly. It really was just seconds.
And Martha, when we hear training, sometimes we assume someone's a beginner. And in this case, these training exercises happen all the time. So why do them? What is the purpose of these training exercises, and why do them here?
Well, specifically for this training mission, and they were experienced pilots and crew, a fairly young captain, fairly experienced is exactly what Pete Hegseth said. But this was priority air transport. It comes out of Fort Belvoir, which is about 20 miles from the airport. And they usually ferry VIPs, senior Army leadership, to the Pentagon, which is, I think, less than a mile from the airport. So in that sense, it would be very important to know exactly how you do this and what the protocols are for doing a mission like that and to practice a mission like that. As Steve pointed out, you have helicopters over the river all the time. In fact, if you sit along the river on a normal day and you see those helicopters and you see the aircraft coming in, you know that those helicopters stay low to avoid them. But if you are flying those priority air transports, as they are called, you need to know how to do that. Now, going forward, after what the Selena read, the Army Secretary nominee said, I don't know whether it's worth the risk to go near Reagan Airport. They may well change that, and they will figure out a way to keep training that unit, because it is an important unit, obviously, and flying VIPs or senior Army leadership or whoever they fly around, and know exactly how to do that, where they begin their mission, where they end their mission.
And Selena, I understand the former transportation secretary is responding now. What is Pete Buttigieg saying to these allegations from President Trump?
Yeah, he's directly responding to President Trump, suggesting and attacking his predecessors under the Biden and Obama administrations for hiring people that he said were unqualified to be air traffic controllers. So this is Buttigieg's statement. He is the former Department of Transportation head. He said, quote, despicable. As families grieve, Trump should be leading, not lying. We put safety first, drove down close calls, grew air traffic control, and had 0 commercial airline crash fatalities out of millions of flights on our watch. President Trump now oversees the military and the FAA. One of his first acts was to fire and suspend some of the key personnel who helped keep our skies safe. Time for the president to show actual leadership and explain what he will do to prevent this from happening again. Now, very quickly, after the president talked about this moment of tragedy and anguish, he shifted to also attacking his predecessors for what he is calling those diversity hires, saying that this led to less unqualified people to be in the FAA. This is despite the fact that the diversity policy he was referring to was in place for the entirety of his first administration. So during that press briefing, President Trump offering a lot of speculation, but no clear answers, no further answers about what exactly caused this. The president very quickly shifting his tone to political attacks. But at the same time, President Trump is saying that he does not want this investigation to drag out for years, that he wants to get these answers very quickly. But he was also pressed in that briefing room on whether it's appropriate to be making these speculations while this investigation is still ongoing. And again, making those attacks on those previous hires and the diversity initiatives without offering any evidence.
And we are looking live at the Potomac River, where that recovery effort is now underway. That will no doubt be a big part of this investigation, what they pull from the river. Aaron, the NTSB is leading the investigation at this point. They're set to give a briefing later today. What are you listening for there? We're
not going to hear much. They are only going to go over, as they typically do, how they're going to go about their mission and the goal of preventing something similar from ever happening again. But they are going to take some immediate steps. They'll begin pulling records from American Airlines about Flight 5342, the passenger manifest, the records of the crew members who were on board. They'll also begin studying some of the radar data that's been so crucial to our early understanding of what's gone on and whether the helicopter was flying at a proper height, below the mandated 200 feet or not, as radar suggests. The NTSB is also going to start collecting eyewitness video images. There'll be a public push to understand what eyewitnesses saw, what they may have heard. And then, of course, they'll start getting into the technical components of the plane, the maintenance record, both of the Army Black Hawk helicopter and its crew, the American Airlines Bombardier plane and its crew. And those steps together, the president was quite right about something. It does often take the NTSB a long time, but they're not looking to answer our curiosity questions. The NTSB's goal is to prevent a similar accident in the future, and undoubtedly, eventually, we might see some conclusions about deconflicting in the very busy airspace over Reagan National.
All right, Aaron Katersky, Gio Benitez, Martha Raddatz, Sam Sweeney, Selena Wang, thank you all. We'll be right back right after the break.
What does it take